we did it. We finally were able to get two boomers together and figure out how to do Discord chatting. As you can see, the overlay is a little different too for all of the old hit fans of the show. You guys have been fucking complaining a lot. But without further ado, I bring to you Michael Tracey. I put you down as independent journo. Are you fine with that, or do you want to change that?
I'm fine with that. I don't really care. Call me a piece of shit or whatever.
I wasn't going to call you a piece of shit. So as a matter of fact, let's just get started with that really quickly. Some of the fans of the show already know this, but you are one of my favorite personalities on Twitter for probably the worst reasons. But I mean, and I can confirm other people also feel this way, but I love just whenever a take is about to happen and everybody's fucking talking about the thing, you know what I mean? Whatever that thing might be for the day, I know that I'm gonna go over to your profile and see something that I 100% disagree with, despite the fact that we are kind of on the same side on certain issues. But I know I'm going to look at the way you angle it or the way you frame an issue, and I'm entertained by it. I genuinely am. So I don't, especially when everyone's takes are the fucking same.
As long as you, derive some value from it, I would rather you have that reaction than just, wow, this is boring and predictable, and I'm not actually, coming away with any novel insight, so I kind of actually appreciate that reaction.
Yeah, it's at least it's unique, in the sense that I know what every single person is going to say
right
on any given issue. I know that, like, especially when it comes to mainstream media, I know exactly what they're going to say. Mainstream media figures are fairly predictable, but when it comes to your takes, I'm like, I know I'm going to be very upset but at least entertained at the same time.
I hope you don't get too upset. I hope you can cope and you're not excessively triggered.
No, if I was triggered even remotely, I probably wouldn't want to have you on this show, right? I mean, that's not the kind of...
Fair enough.
That's not necessarily the kind of person I am. But so let's get started. So obviously, what's on everyone's minds, the way this conversation was originally supposed to be structured is on like the Sri Lanka stuff. But I don't know if you mind talking about Russiagate first, or do you want to talk about Sri Lanka?
I've been much more immersed in Russia. Obviously, the Sri Lanka comment, which is sort of a passing observation, we could talk about it if you wanted, in whatever order. But obviously, for most of my energies have been devoted to Russia.
Oh, I know.
But it's up to you.
Okay. Well, I already wrote.
If you've even been tangentially following anything I've done, you would.
I'm very familiar, and again. Despite the fact that you and I have been probably on the same camp for the majority of this time in regards to our perspective on the Russia hysteria and how far mainstream media has gone to to put forward this insane narrative that everything that the Trump administration is doing is entirely because they're technically blackmailed by Russia or some shit, and that this blundering idiotic, completely unprofessional band of ex-criminals got together and were able to pull off the heist of a century, where they stole the election with the help of Russian oligarchs and this international criminal network. I think it's a kind of a crazy narrative. It probably relies on Cold War anti-Russian sentiment a little bit too much. I've been called a Kremlin agent a lot of times. And then now, by those same people, not the same people who called me a Kremlin agent, but those same people who were calling me a libcuck back then are now saying, oh, take the L, you took the L, you were wrong about Russia, despite the fact that I covered Russia, but not as extensively as anyone else. And
part of me wants to ask you to specifically define libcuck, and part of me does not.
Yeah, it's just he's just a cuck who's a liberal.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. But yeah, in regards to Russiagate, you and I are maybe not as vocal. I'm not as vocal as you were, and my perspective has changed in the aftermath of the report, where I think that the Democrats should consistently continue to weaponize it in a similar fashion that Republicans did with Benghazi, and move as quickly away from the election, not election meddling, but the collusion conversation as far away as possible from that. and start looking at the other findings that that investigation also was able to uncover, like the Michael Cohen testimony that is aiding another additional investigation that's currently happening in regards to election finance, right? Or campaign finance laws.
Right. Well, I mean, he's pleaded guilty to that anyway, so that investigation isn't so much actively underway. But here's the thing: you can say that you want to move on from the collusion elements of the Mueller episode or the broader Russian interference episode. It's hard to even know like what term to use to encapsulate the entire thing because it's so sprawling and multifaceted. But in my mind, they're not separable, right? Because the only reason that any of these obstruction considerations ever arose was because there was an investigation launched, and originally by the FBI, they claim in July 2016, that was later folded into Mueller in May 2017 after Trump fired Comey. So and all of that was predicated on this notion of, did Trump collusively engage with the Russian state, or did his associates do the same? So for the people who now want to fixate exclusively on obstruction, you have to deal with the reality that there would be no obstruction question whatsoever had not this initial investigation been launched in the way it was launched. And if you're a progressive, if you're a leftist or a socialist or whatever your precise ideological like sectarian categorization is, you have to reckon with the fact that this investigation had its genesis in an FBI and CIA conspiracy theory with the aid of the DNC and Hillary, and even arguably neocons, which has as its foundational premise this militaristic idea that Trump's ostensible deviations from foreign policy consensus rose to the level of suspicion that they justify this intensive criminal investigative focus, right? And that all these very dubious and disparate, quote, ties or Russian connections that people kind of melded into this wider narrative, those are all warranted, the suspicion that they warranted. And,
Wait,
if you look at,
are you implying that the military industrial complex was operating in unison against Donald Trump because of his like I guess unorthodox foreign policy perspectives? Is that what you're saying? Or
no, I'm not saying that they're all operating in unison. The military industrial complex is wide ranging and has competing interests. So right now, parts of the military industrial complex love Trump because he's increasing military spending. He has a close he gives the defense contractors everything they want. He helps broker arms deals between Lockheed Martin and Saudi Arabia. So no, they're not upset with him in that regard. I'm saying specifically as to the genesis of the Trump-Russia conspiracy or collusion investigation, it did arise from a paranoid, irrational outburst in reaction to Trump in 2016, where they wove together all these disparate facts into a narrative that was fundamentally fictitious.
Okay, but do you not think that it was a reasonable, at the time, given the information that we had in regards to Russian election meddling, which other people who are also agreeing with you, like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, but they, I guess, disagree with you on this part of the perspective. Don't you think that it was a reasonable investigation to at least start?
Well, I mean, Taibbi, I know for certain because I've discussed it directly with him, has the same concerns I do as to the genesis of the investigation. Greenwald, I don't want to characterize his position. I don't think we're actually that far apart on it. It's just a matter of emphasis in a way. But anyway, I'll speak for myself. In order to say that it was justified when it was launched, right, you have to say that these supposed links and connections and ties between Trump associates and Russia had some foundation that would give rise to the suspicion that a crime had been committed in relation to those contacts, and not a single person. I mean, so a lot of people were charged with crimes, right? So Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, Cohen,
I know, but we're talking about
Papadopoulos.
even before that. This precedes everything. We're talking about launching the investigation.
It doesn't precede everything because the reason that the investigation was launched was in part to investigate the actions of people like George Papadopoulos, who
Fair.
it is understood, and he personally claims, and I think he had a reasonable case for this, that the investigation was launched in response to actions that he took and that were supposed to have been somehow collusive or illicit. And Mueller exerted extreme pressure on Papadopoulos.
Whoa. Uh-oh. Hello? Can you hear me?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Do you want to turn your camera back on? I don't know what just happened there, but...
Hey, yeah. Yeah, I'm back.
Disconnected for a second?
Oh, and your voice is now clear too.
Oh,
so I don't know.
Well, there we go.
What happened there?
Fixed two birds with one.
The stream's okay.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Okay, and actually, I hear you a lot better now. So maybe it was a divine intervention. Okay, so the investigation was at least in part launched on the basis of George Papadopoulos, right? And George Papadopoulos was thought to have engaged in collusive activity.
Yeah.
And Mueller not only couldn't find any evidence of that whatsoever, he only charged him on this very trivial technicality whereby Papadopoulos lied. His supposed lie to the FBI was essentially amounted to that he misstated the date of a meeting he had with this mysterious foreign professor, Maltese professor named Joseph Mifsud by 8 days. So Mueller could only ensnare him on this really trivial technicality. So when you're talking about the predicate of the overall investigation, it usually boils down to Papadopoulos, Carter Page, who had a FISA warrant issued on him in October of 2016 that drew on the Steele dossier, which was this.
Well, the FISA warrant, the FISA warrant was separate from the Steele dossier and the claims inside the Steele dossier. No, I thought that Carter Page's, or at least he was like being tracked for. I mean, look, I'm not gonna lie. This is not
in terms of the FISA warrant. Let me just clarify because it's important. In terms of the FISA warrant itself, so Carter Page had arose suspicions prior to.
Yeah, okay, that's what I meant. All right, no, that's separately.
But in terms of the FISA warrant, I mean, FISA. If you got a FISA warrant on a U.S. citizen, which Carter Page was, that's one of the most invasive warrants that you could ever acquire because, number one, you don't know about it when it's issued, so all your communications are then subject to government investigation.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that aspect, and I know I don't like that either. But I'm just
they used the Steele dossier in the warrant application to obtain that FISA warrant.
Okay,
and now we know that Steele dossier was essentially fraudulent.
Okay, I don't disagree with the Steele dossier. What I'm simply stating is, and again, we can't brush past this fact, but the fact of the matter is, if a foreign government is attempting to meddle in our elections, and there is enough evidence for that, right? And this is something that we all agree on at this point, right? But Russia, at the very least, attempted to meddle in our elections, and that's something that we all agree on, right? Do you not agree with that?
Well, I mean, I think you got to define what meddling is, and you have to define what so-called interference is. This has been one of my...
And by the way, this is not something that is outside of the norm. Russia does this with other countries as well. They do it with us. We do it all over the world. We do it in way worse and way more invasive ways than Russia, and it oftentimes even leads to more violent outcomes. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, again, like the fact of the matter that, or at the very least, like even people like Glenn Greenwald agree on, is that Russia did try to do this, and if a foreign government is engaging in election meddling, and this is at least a known thing in the intelligence community, and then a leader is very openly calling them out, and there is enough dots to connect that leader and the members of his campaign back to that foreign, I guess, adversary at the time, I think that's a reasonable investigation to start.
But the dots never connected. Right, Mueller conclusively found that the dots never connected. So,
no, I mean, they found it after the investigation. I'm talking about, was it enough for an investigation to be launched? And I think yes, but I guess you and I disagree on that.
because at the time there was never any basis for even having a reasonable suspicion that the dots connected. It was always idiotic. I mean, one of the main tenets of this entire theory supposedly was that Trump got on a press conference in July of 2016 and said, Russia, if you're listening, find Hillary Clinton's emails. I mean, if you watch MSNBC, even now, when they show their video montages of all the supposedly damning footage of Trump, purportedly colluding, they'll still show that one clip where he was cracking a joke in front of the entire.
Okay, but don't you think Trump
press
is
corps.
stupid enough? Don't you think Trump is stupid enough to literally ask for some shit like that? Like, honestly, don't you think he's stupid enough? First of all, if they were colluding behind closed doors, he probably wouldn't say it in that respect. But
Right.
like, but
If there was a
but obviously,
conspiracy,
if there's,
why would he announce it on national TV?
I know, I understand, because he's that fucking stupid, though. Just because, like, one of the biggest reasons why I never thought that there was any sort of, like, collusion, or I never thought that there could be collusion in regards to, like, election meddling, was because Donald Trump is a fucking buffoon, and worse than that, he's surrounded by other like-minded buffoons for the most part, so it would have been very difficult to keep under wraps. And that was at least, in part of the reason why I thought that like this, long-standing conspiracy that Russia was blackmailing Trump was incomplete, to say the least, right?
But you acknowledge that long-standing conspiracy has been a central component of America media and political discussion for 3 years, right?
Yeah, of course. I've look, the breaking point, the final breaking point for me. I was always skeptical, but the final breaking point was when Donald Trump was, for some fucking weird reason, not absolutely fucking up with the South Korea, North Korea, like nuclear disarmament peace talks, and abiding by the South Korean president's requests and halting military activity in the region. And Rachel Maddow got up on TV, on national television, and straight up said, and took a more militant stance than the Trump administration. And that was when I was like, okay, fuck this 100,000%. This is absolutely preposterous. You have no moral consistency if you're gonna attack the Trump administration from the right with a more militant perspective. Okay, so
and
that's
the militant perspective she was assuming in that instance, right, was derived from her hunch that somehow Putin was, pulling the strings, right, and the North Korea negotiations all were to appease Putin somehow. Right?
Yeah.
So that's how deep the infection of this entire thing went. That people assume that Trump's negotiations with North Korea, which were done at the behest of President Moon of South Korea, not Putin, that was all part of the Russia conspiracy.
And also widely supported by the people of South Korea as well. The people of South Korea at the time were in support of halting military activity and like military training in the region, like U.S. military training in the region. So that was like well received by South Koreans and also backed by or requested by the South Korean administration. I talked about this extensively. Other people like Aaron Matt, I think his name is right. I don't know how to say his last name. They were covering, Mate. They were all covering it, and 100%. Like we're in agreement there. But
let me just say something.
I still don't disagree on the grounds that this investigation was a bullshit one. And here's my logic for it. Maybe it's fucking dumb, but if a bank has been robbed, okay, and a known criminal is talking about, like very publicly talking about how he would love to rob this bank, and then one of the people in his gang of thieves, I guess, is found on the side of the bank during that day and has no alibi or whatever, I think that's a reasonable investigation to start. Now, waiting for the end result of that investigation is what we should have done, and we didn't do. And I agree. I think that we should have probably taken a couple steps back, and instead of just like engaging in Hillary Clinton apologetics and trying to make it so that this scary foreign adversary is responsible for all of the evils of American politics, all the way to even like Black Lives Matter fucking rallies and shit. I mean, it was crazy. It's just like anything that opposes the neoliberal establishment was blamed on Russia and Russian interference, which is silly. But
I just don't think that the bank robbery hypothetical is really analogous to this type of investigation, which actually was unprecedented in its scope and nature in U.S. history. So, I mean, you have to kind of assess it on its own terms, whereas like a typical bank robbery is like not even in the same ballpark, right? So it's kind of the analogy kind of confuses things. But let me just address two points that you raised, right? So this notion that we have to investigate Russia meddling. Okay, if we want to investigate this notion of Russia dispatching Twitter trolls and Facebook memes and these cartoon photos of cartoons of Bernie Sanders with a ripped chest in a Speedo, if you think that should be seriously investigated, fine, go right ahead. I'm not going to stop you.
No, that element of it is we're in agreement there. Like I think that
but that's part of the meddling.
No,
right?
I know, but they used it. I know I talked about this extensively as well. They used it to fight anything and everything that they saw as opposition, whether it be from the left or from the right. And ultimately, my main perspective on this was, look, it's not like Trump is doing anything beyond the reasonable Republican agenda. Maybe with a few...
the North Korea thing is an exception.
Yeah, exactly. With a few notable exceptions that I agree with, that he did a decent job at. But beyond that, especially when it comes to domestic politics, like Trump did nothing out of the ordinary that any other Republican wouldn't do. And to claim that Putin has some sort of fucking extortion racket going on where he's like forcing Trump to do all of these things is preposterous. And it kind of takes away from the main problem, is that no, this is how U.S. politics is, and I think a lot of people instead of finally pulling the curtain and realizing the disgusting underbelly of American politics and seeing it for what it was, decided to engage in this grand conspiracy narrative that made them more comfortable, because then they could sit at home and feel better about themselves, that America isn't this American politics isn't about bipartisan support when it comes to damaging foreign affairs and destroying or destabilizing entire regions and terrible domestic policy.
But one of the reasons why people were having that insane overwrought reaction was because they were feeding off the hysteria generated by this investigation for 3 years, right? So they knew that there was this, mysterious and ill-defined FBI / Muller investigation going on into the Trump-Russia thing that was never really well established as to what that even consisted of. So the specter of that looming over everything actually had a material effect on people having that deranged reaction, which you just laid out. At the Young Turks, where I worked for a year and a half or a little more, I went around to town hall meetings in 2017 that, where these energized Democratic activist groups would be showing up to Republican and Democratic town halls to express their priorities in terms of blunting the momentum of the Trump administration, or whatever the saying was at the time. And at a number of the meetings that I went to, probably a majority of them, at a majority of the meetings, the plurality of the questions asked to the member of Congress had to do with Russia. And if you go into this peak period of hysteria in 2017, congressional staffers were telling me that the number one phone call they were receiving from constituents had to do with Russia. So that you can't separate that from the investigation itself, because the investigation is what was generating a lot of that outsized, overwrought reaction. And let me just say one more other thing about Trump being a buffoon or being stupid, right? I really think that's a mistake, because I don't think Trump is stupid.
And he's smart enough to listen to the populace and understand, or he's smart enough to listen to his base and demagogue.
This guy had one of the most shocking electoral victories, if not the most shocking, in all of American history, right? Virtually nobody thought he had any chance when he started running.
I don't think I don't think he thought he was going to win. If we're being honest.
Right, but the point is, you have to have a certain kind of intelligence to accomplish a feat like that. And I actually remember during the George W. Bush years, a lot of liberals would smugly say, "Oh, George Bush is an idiot. He makes all these malapropisms. He says these, he misspeaks and stuff, and that means he's stupid." That was never a useful mode of analysis for George W. Bush, right? Stupid or not, he won the election to the presidency twice. So, you got to deal with that.
Okay, so there's obviously, this is a multivariate problem, and of course, it isn't exclusively because George W. Bush was like a charismatic figure. Obviously, there's other factors involved with George W. Bush winning the presidency, especially the first time around.
But whatever the reasons, he still did it, right?
No. I understand. I think maybe we need to maybe we need to reconfigure what we think wins elections, and that's precisely what I'm saying. And I think like blaming it on Russia is counterproductive in that respect. But building a grand Russia narrative or an anti-Russia narrative in order to like attack Donald Trump is something that Republicans did with Benghazi, and then they moved quickly beyond the scope of that investigation during Benghazi and focused exclusively on 30,000 deleted emails, right? And I'm saying that this is something strategically that the Democrats should be doing, moving quickly beyond the main investigation and using other findings that using other things that they found throughout that investigation to weaponize that against the Republican Party and against Donald Trump, rather than focusing on Russia as a nefarious conspiratorial figure.
Listen, I think there is some truth to this notion that Democrats latching on to Russia has disadvantaged Trump politically in certain respects, right? I mean, the Republicans lost considerably in the House anyway in the midterm elections, and I think you could attribute at least a portion of that to these kind of affluent liberals who are Russia obsessed being especially energized and getting out the vote in like these suburban districts, right? So I mean, my hometown district in New Jersey had been Republican my entire life, going back to the 80s until just this past year. And I think because there were a lot of people in like Montclair, New Jersey, who sit around watching Maddow and got all their friends to vote. So I mean, I think you can't totally discount that there was some political advantage to Democrats having fueled emotion around this issue. But I'm not looking at it from the standpoint of what advice can I give to Democrats to best achieve their goals. I'm looking at what are the facts, what are the what's the kind of impartial analysis of the nature of this investigation, and if in some sense Democrats can leverage this FBI, CIA militaristic conspiracy theory to their political advantage, I mean, sure. I mean, if you want to, go right ahead. But I'm not going to necessarily endorse that just because it might confer select advantages to Democrats, right? And also on the point of Trump being stupid, I mean, the reason I brought that up was not to extol whatever depraved form of intelligence Trump has as like a TV star and a successful presidential candidate. It was just to say that if you use that as your frame of reference for understanding his conduct during the Russia episode, then yeah, maybe you would be inclined to say he could have been so stupid, so like fantastically stupid as to announce his conspiracy on national TV in front of the entire assembled press corps. But I think that would have distorted your perception of what this actually was, because Trump may not be able to string together a coherent sentence most of the time, but he's not like he's not like it's not like he's so stupid as he needs to be committed to a mental asylum, right? He has some marginal competence. So that's why I mean,
he has enough marginal competence and a better understanding of what the Republican base wanted, better than even the Republican consultants at the time that were trying to obviously reconfigure the Republican agenda in regards to immigration. This is like widely reported on and written about as well. During the Mitt Romney era, Republicans were trying to make a switch to captivate more of the Latino base of voters, and they were going to start talking about comprehensive immigration reform, and Donald Trump kind of, with one streak, ruined that mentality and showed exactly how successful right-wing populism is. And
two other big ones there. Trump was really the only candidate in the Republican primary in 2016. And I went to a bunch of his events at that time who would say over and over again, we're not cutting your Social Security, not cutting your Medicare.
Yeah, he lied. He lied a lot. And that's like a little bit different than the Republicans that came before him. Republicans and Democrats both lie all the time during the campaign. But he was inconsistent in his message, so much so that just people liked the cult of personality that he had built around himself. So that's a part of the reason why they liked him. They thought that he was speaking to their anxieties, especially when it comes to like racial displacement and things of that nature. But Hillary Clinton ran a terrible campaign on top of that too. And that's what I'm like. So that's something that always frustrated me, is like, if you don't learn from the mistakes of like previous campaigns, and you only care, and if you're like an establishment figure at this point, a consultant or whatever, and you only care about maintaining your position, and you have to make it seem like you were right all along, then you're going to keep losing elections to people like Trump, and maybe even worse, an actual intelligent person who has like fascist tendencies. Like, I would consider Trump to be, with his rhetoric and the things that he says, a proto-fascist, but not a fascist, not an outright fascist. He's not, like, guided by any sort of discernible ideology. He's just kind of, like, stoking the racial fires and whatnot fairly frequently with his anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Muslim attitudes. But what if we had someone who was very deliberately pushing that agenda with an ideology behind it? So...
But here's another point that is sort of related, and this is why I don't allow myself to get boxed into this idea that I had to endorse this FBI series of machinations, because I'm not. Why is it incumbent on me to endorse what the FBI is doing, right? Anyway, if you look at the part of the Mueller report having to do with obstruction, there are sections in which Mueller has interviewed people in the defense or in the intelligence community, like Dan Coates, who's the director of national intelligence, and Mike Rogers, who was the head of the NSA, where they relayed to Mueller their private communications with Trump, where Trump complained to them directly that the Russia investigation was hobbling his ability to conduct foreign affairs, especially vis-a-vis Russia. And I remember at the time in 2017, people would be chastising me, saying, "Oh, you're exaggerating this idea that the domestic turmoil and frenzy around Russia is actually having a tangible effect on Trump's ability to conduct foreign policy." And it turns out that Trump himself was stating in his private communications that it was having that effect. So now relations with Russia are at a nadir, or at a dangerous low. And Trump wasn't actually able to enact, because of political and legal constraints, the proposals that he had ran a successful campaign on.
I mean, I think they
2016.
got around that fairly effectively. They burned translation tapes before like any of the intelligence community could get to it. They still held private meetings with Putin. They still continued to do whatever they were going to do in regards to the way they treat Russia. Like, Trump might say something, but taking him on his word on that respect, especially when he feels the pressure of an ongoing investigation, is, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that.
I'm not just taking him at his word, though. I'm looking at his actions. His actions toward Russia have been largely belligerent, actually in contradiction to his campaign rhetoric, and much more antagonistic than even Obama. So, one of the big claims of the Russiagate proponents was that there was this mysterious episode in 2016 where the Republicans modified their platform, the party platform, to make it so-called softer on arming Ukraine. And Mueller says that there's no evidence that was done at the behest not just of Putin but of Trump. They say Trump wasn't even aware of it. But the reason why that this one like minor operative did attempt to change the platform was because she wanted to align it with Trump's campaign rhetoric, which was more, quote, dovish than Mitt Romney 4 years prior, who had, his representatives had influenced the platform before Trump. But it turns out that Trump didn't actually follow through on that and ended up arming Ukraine anyway. I can give you 5 or 6 more policy actions that Trump took that totally fly in the face of this notion that he was going to pursue détente with Russia, which is what he advocated over the course of the campaign. So I'm not taking Trump's word for it alone. I'm looking at his actions. I mean, during the peak.
So you're saying that the ongoing Russia investigation didn't actually end up changing Trump's perspective on dealing with Russia, and they continued. That's precisely what I was saying as well.
It did. It changed his policy approach. So it had the effect of placing pressure on Trump where it would be politically untenable for him to do anything that would be perceived as advantageous toward Russia or soft on Russia or not sufficiently aggressive toward Russia. And that was actually the main line of criticism that most Democrats used against Trump vis-a-vis foreign policy. Oh, he's not being belligerent enough. We have this.
Yeah, he's not being militaristic enough. He's not being militant enough against Russia. And like, I understand that. But ultimately, my perspective is, again, ultimately, Trump still did whatever he was going to do. I think, didn't he lift sanctions as well? I mean,
no.
This is like, regardless, like I said, if he was going to bomb like Russian bases in Syria, he still continued to do it. I don't think that was like pushed by Democrats. I think that was just something that he was interested in doing. So
it's a combination of factors.
He was interested. His generals were interested in doing that.
The point is that the incentives that came about as a result of this investigation, which at its core was militaristic because it was derived from the CIA and FBI, who had these ingrained biases against any cooperation with Russia. This incentives that resulted from that militated against Trump doing anything that comported with this notion of détente with Russia. And of course, there might be other variables as well that influence his behavior. But I'm saying it does stand to reason that if the opposition party and your own party are both saying, hey, you better be careful, you can't do anything that could be remotely construed as suspiciously favorable toward Russia, that's going to influence your policy approach and the manner in which you conduct foreign affairs. And I think there's a totality of evidence to suggest that at this point.
Am I wrong? You said that he hadn't. Wait, hold on. I'm sorry, but you said he hadn't lifted sanctions, but the Trump administration's like Treasury Department did lift 3 sanctions on firms controlled by Deripaska.
There are different sanctions here, right? I mean, so
okay. That's okay. I was just making sure that we're on the same page there. So he did, or at least the Treasury Department did. Not, right, and I'm not talking about
but the sanctions that people were screaming about primarily that Flynn discussed with Kislyak during the transition period, and then he supposedly lied about. Those are the sanctions having to do with like that Obama level just before he left office in retaliation for the election interference. Those were never lifted. Trump ended up signing a bill passed overwhelmingly by both houses of Congress. Actually, Bernie Sanders voted against this bill to his credit in summer of 2017, having to do with Russia sanctions. So yeah, they did. There are some marginal sanctions that are lifted, but the notion of tying that in to the broader Russian narrative doesn't make sense, because I mean the U.S. Treasury and the entire government apparatus has a whole host of different sanctions that.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I wasn't referencing like specifically the sanctions that you're referencing, I guess. But my point is Trump has still been able to take whatever policy decisions that he wanted to take, or his administration has still acted without the without, I guess, the wholesale approval of like the intelligence community or I guess mainstream media that was significantly more anti-Russia than Trump. And that was what I was trying to say, is that I can't conclusively tie Trump's actions beyond what you just said in regards to his words, where he was claiming that the Russia investigation was not allowing him to do his job. I can't say that it had a causal effect. It had a direct effect on Trump taking any sort of action one way or the other about Russia.
Yeah, I mean, you can't assert with 100% certainty that it had a explicit causal effect, right? But you can't assert that with almost any variable that could influence.
Yeah. And by the way, this kind of brings us into the second part of the conversation, which I think like what I wanted to understand is like what are some of the worst impacts about the Russiagate hysteria in your opinion? Because like I said, I admitted that I think that the unending focus on Russia absolutely was a way to misdirect from the misdeeds of the Clinton campaign and a failure to actually put together like a genuinely popular presidential campaign, and instead of like looking at it and analyzing it and maybe changing our policy perspective in regards to the Democratic Party, we decided to just blame a foreign adversary. But beyond that, I don't think that there are any like sort of tangible xenophobic elements or even like stoking the fears of like a Cold War 2.0 in regards to what like Glenn Greenwald and even you have said at different times. Like, I don't know if that's I think that might be a little bit hyperbole there.
Well, so here are there are so many, I don't even know where to begin, but let me just give you a couple tangible examples of the harms inflicted. So number one is in May of 2017, Trump fires Comey, right? And Andrew McCabe, who was then the deputy director of the FBI, becomes acting director. And Andrew McCabe opens this separate counterintelligence investigation on Trump personally. And McCabe, in his recent book tour, because Trump later fired him, stated that his rationale for opening that investigation drew from McCabe's perception that Trump's rhetorical approach toward Russia and his foreign policy positions were so heterodox, or such a deviation from foreign policy consensus, that it could rise to the level of actually being criminal. So effectively, McCabe, and you can go look at his statements, don't take my word for it, he was saying that we are now criminalizing effectively foreign policy deviations. And that's a extraordinarily dangerous precedent to enshrine, because you know what? If Bernie Sanders is elected, and sorry, my screen just went black for a second. And if Bernie Sanders is elected and he takes some step foreign policy wise with regard to, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Cuba, you now have a president enshrined whereby these unelected federal law enforcement apparatus officials like McCabe and Rod Rosenstein, he also collaborated with to potentially remove Trump extra legally through the 25th Amendment and wear a wire on Trump in the Oval Office. They now have a president.
Well, the 25th Amendment is separate than Russia collusion, though, right?
Well, no, it's not separate, because the 25th Amendment plot hatched by Rosenstein and also these senior FBI officials like McCabe, Lisa Page, this guy Baker, who was the general counsel of the FBI, that arose because Trump fired Comey, who was overseeing the collusion investigation.
Yeah, but Trump's firing of Comey, which is a separate point that we can talk about, was technically, in my opinion, definitely obstruction of justice. He admitted as much. It's just that there was no, like, the investigation might have been faulty, but the obstruction of justice charge would have stuck if it was for any other person outside of Barr who was appointed to that position exclusively because he said he would not prosecute anyone on obstruction of justice charges if the collusion charges were not met. So, I mean, he definitely did do everything in his power to stop this. And even the report shows that, right? I mean,
but the 25th Amendment and the wearing of the wire proposals, right? And they were serious proposals. I mean, they weren't being, as far as we can tell, according to Andrew McCabe and according to this guy Baker and others, these were not jokes. These were not this wasn't sarcasm. This was the senior most officials in the federal law enforcement apparatus taking it upon themselves to effectively depose the elected president. So you can hate Trump all you want, and I probably agree with most of your rationale for hating Trump, but that's an anti-democratic principle right there that's being enshrined within the, quote, deep state. And you don't have to use that term.
I guess it depends, though, because it depends on if you think Trump is an honest actor or a completely belligerent actor or not. Because
it doesn't depend on Trump being an honest actor. It depends on him being the elected president. If you want to remove a dishonest actor who got elected president, vote him out. Don't rely on the FBI
but
and
it
the
doesn't
CIA
work that way, and Republicans
employ...
have shown that it doesn't work that way. I mean, look at what happened during the Bill Clinton investigations. Like, obviously, there were different factors that led up to an investigation, but I think you and I both know that once an investigation is launched, whatever charges stick, especially if you have the infrastructure to back up that talking point and flood the marketplace with enough hysteria, once an investigation starts, that's it. They can get you on perjury. They can get you on obstruction of justice. They can get you on whatever the fuck they want to get you on, as long as they can actually prove that you did those things. And for me, I think Donald Trump absolutely did obstruct justice, just like Bill Clinton lied. You know what I mean? Or these are. It doesn't have anything to do with like actual truth or actual honesty or integrity at all. That's just that's usually how people weaponize the justice system.
Okay, yeah, I would agree that...
And Watergate as well.
I would agree that, overzealous prosecutors will often weaponize whatever tools are at their disposal to entrap people who can be caught on some procedural crime, right? So that's true, and less powerful people than Trump are subject to that all the time. So I don't dispute that at all. And actually, prior to 2016, when our the collective our collective brains were not as broken by Trump, that's kind of the stuff that I reported on, right? But things changed. The point is, Rosenstein and McCabe were only contemplating those extra legal methods of removing the president because of a chain of events that stemmed from this whole treasonous collusion conspiracy that was being investigated. So you can't easily distinguish that from the obstruction stuff that came afterward, because they're all it's the same trajectory. It's the same factual trajectory which led to that point. So and you don't have to say that Trump is somehow an honest broker or some reliable to object to the FBI, to the senior most officials in the federal law enforcement apparatus saying we can take it upon ourselves to unilaterally remove the president. Rosenstein went so far as to claim that he had recruited cabinet members to enact this far-flung 25th Amendment idea.
Yeah, just like Kevin McCarthy openly admitted on Sean Hannity that they used the Benghazi investigation to lower Hillary Clinton's favorability ratings, and look how successful that was. And people still talk about emails. So that's precisely what I'm saying.
Well,
as far as political motivations goes, it's a smart move for not to focus on election meddling or not election meddling, which obviously happened, but collusion, and instead focus on all the other things that he did in the process of trying to bury this investigation, which they should keep hammering.
Well, I don't see a lot of Democrats out there saying we accept the finding of no collusion. I see them engaging in all kinds of mental gymnastics, saying,
yeah, they're bad. I mean, you and I are not in disagreement that the Democratic Party is fucking dog shit. I would wish for them.
So if you're going to pursue any element of the Trump-Russia notion, even if it's strictly obstruction, it's always going to be tied in with this collusion stuff, right?
Why?
So I mean, name to me a Democrat.
Republicans were able to so successfully change the Benghazi narrative from Hillary Clinton personally knew that there was Hillary Clinton personally knew that these attacks were going to happen and did nothing, to Hillary Clinton deleted her fucking emails. Look at her. We need to lock her up. We need to throw her in jail. People died and Hillary Clinton lied. You can very easily change that public narrative. It just depends on if you have the will. But I think the single most important thing here is
Democrats
that if
have
they
the will to change the narrative away from collusion or conspiracy,
no, because they wanted to cover their own asses, and that's precisely what I'm saying. My frustration with the Democratic Party isn't that this investigation got out of hand or anything like that. My frustration with the Democratic Party is that they exclusively tried to weaponize this to cover their own fucking dumbasses once again, as they've done over and over again throughout time. This is precisely this is the biggest point this is the biggest frustration I have with this investigation and the way the Democratic Party dealt with it. They had such a narrow scope. They never talked about it beyond Trump's actions being guided or motivated by Russia in this sinister fashion. It's really frustrating. If they were to focus on any other criminal activity or suspicious behavior that Donald Trump engages in on a fucking daily basis, this and then hyper focused on whatever stuck, this would have been a much different conversation. And I think the reason why Trump is still, shitting his pants and even in the Muller report, showed that he was saying my fucking presidency is over and whatnot, is because of those reasons. Not because there was a grand conspiracy that we had uncovered, but because Donald Trump is truly incompetent in the way that he has been able to successfully fail upwards his entire life, which is a negative consequence of, I guess, intergenerational wealth and capitalism, which we won't get into. But because of that, he's not competent enough to be a good a criminal. And it's very easy to fucking get him on any number of charges. But instead, the Democrats wanted to cover their own asses and claim oh no, Trump only won because of Russia.
Be that as it may, they went with the collusion thing, right? And I think I think it can be. I think it's sort of a mistake to say they was only motivated by covering their own asses. I think a lot of them were convinced of the factual reality of collusion because of what the media was telling them, including much of the progressive media.
I agree.
So you asked me what was one of the tangible harms of all this? Well, how about because of a lot of progressive media organs transformed into these treason alarmists factories, like Mother Jones, for example, David Corn, who appears on MSNBC every half hour, it seems like, was the reporter most responsible for injecting the fraudulent Steele dossier into the American media bloodstream, which caused all this scintillation about, oh my God, is there a P tape and all this juvenile kind of BS.
Okay, the
that
P tape stuff was
just
funny. I mean, it was great. I'm not gonna lie. I thought it was hilarious. It's funny. Belittled.
But it was so stupid though. It was a joke. It wasn't based on anything real.
Yeah, but it was still funny. I know. I agree.
You can
I agree
laugh
with what you're
about
saying.
Trump in a golden shower or something, but I think if it's just a fantasy, like, are you actually doing anything constructive, or are you just amusing yourself?
Oh no, I'm amused because I have a more nihilistic attitude about all of this, and that's precisely why I thought it was funny that there could potentially be a tape out there of Donald Trump getting pissed on in some fucking Moscow hotel. But again, look, there is an element, there's a profit motive here as well at the heart of this. David Corn wants to fucking appear as much as possible. MSNBC and all of these other like mainstream media outlets.
By the way, David Corn ended up collaborating with the FBI. I mean, this is another insane aspect of all of this that people don't talk about enough. David Corn, who is like supposedly this progressive superstar journalist, right, who actually had a good scoop during the 2012 campaign when he got that surreptitious video of Romney saying the 41%, right?
Yeah, 47%.
So 47%. Sorry, yeah, you're right. He ended up not just promulgating the Steele dossier, he ended up handing over the Steele dossier to the FBI, not to just get them to comment on it for like a journalistic purpose, but because he had like some patriotic duty apparently, or that he felt to engage in a direct arrangement with the FBI to investigate this law enforcement rabbit hole. I mean, that's insane. That's like if ordinarily if a journalist were to do that, they would have obliterated their own credibility. You don't just willy-nilly get involved with the FBI in that way.
I disagree with you on the second part of that. The first part of that statement I don't disagree on at all. Like Corn saying, oh, I'm such a fucking patriot and that's why we must oppose Trump and here's why. All that stuff is bullshit, sure. But saying that any other journalist's credibility would be obliterated is absolutely preposterous, and I think you know that as well. That's a historical. Okay, ought to be is different. Yeah, sure, but like that is especially that's mainstream media 101. I know, but that doesn't happen, and it has never happened. And my point at the like right now where I'm at is I'm fucking sick and tired of just I'm sick and tired of like progressives holding themselves to a different standard and constantly fucking handicapping one another rather than full-scale political warfare against the opposition party. That's the way I see it, and that's the way they should be conducting themselves. And that's exactly the same manner in which the Republican Party, despite having a minority of voters, like which is proven at this point, despite the fact that they have a minority of voters in this country, still keep successfully winning fucking the presidency or winning control over the Senate. You got to fucking take on, at some point, you have to say, wow, like these guys know what the fuck they're doing. You know what I mean? And start using their tactics against them. Some people will say that that's amoral or immoral or whatever. I don't give a shit. I just want to fucking win because in the end of the day, politics is just about a redistribution of power. And Democrats have conceded and given far too much power to Republicans, and that's why we're in this right-wing hell that we live in currently.
I think that's a viable perspective from the standpoint of just raw political gamesmanship and what you need to do in order to achieve power, right? But in terms of handicapping themselves, I can't imagine a more egregious way to handicap oneself as an opposition party than to get mired in this conspiracy delusion for 3 years and to actually suck up all the energy that could have been otherwise used to highlight the real harms inflicted by Trump and to subsume it all onto this collusion notion that was basically a fairy tale. I mean,
well, there were plenty of progressive champions that were leading other causes, and some people were showing that they could walk and chew gum and mobilize people by using the populist Russia narrative, which was proven to be untrue at this point. But I mean, people were still pushing for, I mean, Bernie Sanders was still pushing for Medicare for all. There were still very successful mobilizations against Donald Trump trying to dismantle
but even Bernie Sanders, this is what's like a tragic aspect of all this. Even Bernie Sanders, I guess, because he needed to ingratiate himself to some extent with like mainstream liberals and the more democratic establishmentarian figures like Chuck Schumer, who he co-authored a New York Times op-ed with, and other people of that ilk. Even Bernie Sanders, you can find some really embarrassing tweets from 2017 and 2018 where he's like basically affirming the Russiagate narrative, and he said something to like, "We have to find out is Donald Trump advancing the interests of Russia or the United States?"
But could you define Bernie Sanders as someone who, like, would you say that Bernie Sanders like fully subscribed to the Russia narrative and was like actively and deliberately pushing it?
Well, I mean, no, not to the extent
that's my
of others
point.
like Schiff.
I know,
like
for
Schiff
sure. Yes, those people.
But even he ended up being tarnished by it. You know, so not that he focused on it overwhelmingly.
I mean, I don't think people care about that. They don't know Bernie is that guy. They know Bernie is the guy for Medicare for all, and that's precisely why he's successful, and that's why we should continue doing that. But then on the other side, weaponize the Russia investigation as best as possible, move away as quickly as possible from like collusion during the campaign and to any number of different suspicious activities that Trump is engaged in. That's why I was saying this from the start.
But here's another thing that's been so aggravating to me, right? Okay, say you want to just do all-out warfare against the Republicans and totally remove them from power at every possible level, right? Why can't you do that on rational evidence-based grounds? There's ample grounds for achieving that outcome that don't rely whatsoever on getting involved with this treason conspiracy narrative that's, again, was started by the FBI and CIA. Do it from the standpoint of Trump is now in hoc with the Republican donor class that he previously maligned.
Okay, we don't disagree on this. I agree 100% with you on this. And this is boring. I said this from the jump. I agree. I think that we should be doing that. That's precisely my point.
But you asked me for some examples of harm brought about by the investigation. That's one harm. This idea that a huge swath of the quote opposition or resistance ended up hobbled by this and in this kind of conspiratorial frenzy. So to me, that's a tangible harm. I witnessed it with my own eyes. I went to a meeting of the Electoral College actually in December of 2016 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because Trump won Pennsylvania, right? Surprisingly to some. And the resistance and the people who showed up there to express their discontent with Trump were chanting treason, chanting "Don't let Putin in the White House," and screaming "Trump is Hitler and Putin," or some combination of the two, right? So that's the mindset. I'm not kidding. So that's
I know, but
mindset.
People are sheep, Michael. I think you know that, especially when you are mobilizing large swaths of the population and get them to engage in political action. If you have no reasonable substitute, if you can't address the material conditions because you're backed by corporations, just like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is, you have to find something else to mobilize that base. I completely understand this. This is all taking This is all taking the empty, hollowed out shell that is supposed to be class consciousness in the American body politic, and instead of engaging people on class consciousness and realizing the reality of capitalism, they have to fucking mobilize them some other way, and this is the fashion that that the liberals have been able to mobilize their base. And I'm saying that while it is, it's been somewhat effective, as you yourself are admitting, people were fucking out there screaming Trump and Putin. I'm frustrated that I wish that they would use it towards something that would actually would have been rooted in reality. So you and I are not in disagreement there, but I guess, I don't know. I guess we should move on from this point now because we've already fucking addressed it back and forth. But
the thing is, it's so there are so many elements to it that we could discuss for another 6 hours, you know, and so it's that crazily multifaceted, right? That's why we're still immersed in it even now, and it's not ending with this impeachment stuff. I mean, the Democrats, by going down this impeachment route, are going to prolong the self-delusion and the agony and the detachment from reality, and that's part of the reason why.
This is basic Republican shit too. That doesn't excuse the Democrats' behavior for engaging in it, but what I'm simply trying to say is, like, it's not anything beyond the norm in American politics to sensationalize these sorts of things, especially on the liberal side, because they have nothing else to fight for. What else are they going to fight for? Are they going to fight for fucking marginal improvements to a Republican market-based solution to our healthcare problems in the form of Obamacare?
Corporate boards.
Yeah, like, or are they going to take the fucking Amy Klobuchar attitude and be like, hey, we're just going to what is it like? We're gonna take your student loans and be able to refinance them in a fashion that you could already do, or we're gonna give you fucking tax credits. Like, these are not things that appeal to Americans at all, who have much larger problems than that. So they have to try to unify under one umbrella. For the Republican Party, this is easy: being white and the status quo and reinforcing the status quo, and actively and deliberately pushing like racial animus, or actively and deliberately taking all of the economic anxiety that American people feel, anxiety in regards to their future, and turning it into racial animosity towards the other. And it happens to be that the new flavor in town is Latino immigrants. So that's what they're doing. But the Democrats need something like that, so they used the Russiagate. So we understand that. I think, and they're doing that, and they could have used it better. And I wish they did. I wish they did use it better. But
you have somebody now like Elizabeth Warren, who I actually admire, and I think she has some really novel and well-considered insights, especially on economic policy and the concentration of wealth. In terms, she applies that analysis to everything from the banks to the tech companies, right? So I actually appreciate her contributions to American political discourse in a lot of ways. And now I see her coming out and saying we got to impeach Trump on Russia-related grounds, and I think to myself, isn't that going to muddy the waters? Doesn't that cloud the message? I mean, maybe she has a good faith rationale for advocating that position, but I just see it as yet another insistence on prolonging this to the point where it's beyond absurd, because Mueller obliterated the core premises of it with his finding on collusion. You can talk about obstruction all you want, but the only reason that there was ever even a thing was because of the collusion element. And Mueller systematically and exhaustively went through every conceivable angle on collusion, including this whole notion of Trump engaging in illicit business practices predating his presidency as somehow constituting collusion. He even looked at that stuff and he said it's not established. It essentially did not happen. So you're just
okay, but obstruction of justice did, right? You don't think that there's enough evidence for obstruction of justice beyond whether or not the investigation should have been launched at all? Or, I mean, I still hold the belief that the investigation was reasonable to launch, given the fact that Russia had meddled in our elections, and that there was a person who was out there with people in his campaign that were involved, at least tangentially, with Russia to some respect. And sure, you might consider that to be thin, but there's still evidence. I mean, there's still evidence of Donald Trump Jr., for example, meeting with Russian envoys, right? I mean, this is still evidence. I mean, even Glenn agrees that this is like enough evidence to at least continue an investigation in this respect.
Well, no, I mean, Glenn actually was asked specifically on Democracy Now! Last week about whether he thinks the supposed, the alleged obstructive acts were impeachable, and he said no, because
no, not the obstructive acts. I'm talking about the legitimacy of whether or not this election should have been. I mean, this investigation should have started. I
don't think that's exactly true. Let's not characterize somebody's position.
I was just talking about his recent interview with Sam Cedar, where he admitted that the investigation was definitely legitimate, and he was waiting to find out what the conclusion of it was.
I'm actually doing a podcast with him tomorrow, and we're actually gonna go back and forth on that. So if people want to tune in and hear the full details of our, I don't even think it's a disagreement so much as it's sort of like a slightly different emphasis. Anyway, what was I saying? I was saying that oh my God, I lost my train of thought. What was I about to say?
I don't know. We were talking about obstruction. You were gonna tell me why Glenn doesn't think obstruction is.
Okay. So you're right. So he doesn't think it, and I agree with this. And if you read the obstruction, if they have the patience, they should actually read the full report, because it's not just Barr who said that obstruction is not chargeable. It was Mueller. I mean, Mueller, he went through each potential obstructive act and put forward competing factors as to whether it would be prosecutable under federal obstruction statutes. And in some cases, the evidence was stronger. In some cases, it was weaker. But the point is that he weighed both sides of the consideration there, and he concluded that there wasn't sufficient cause to recommend those charges, which he could have done.
Are you talking about obstruction or are you talking about collusion still? Sorry.
This is obstruction. This is obstruction.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
Mueller could have, per his delegated authority by the Department of Justice, recommended obstruction charges. And then it could have been litigated, right? So it could have.
Well, I think he gave that up. I think he gave that authority over to Barr, but knowing full well that Barr's position on this was going to be that if enough evidence hadn't been found on collusion, that obstruction charges alone were not enough to impeach a president.
And
you could infer from that reasonably that Mueller knew that.
Mueller wouldn't be recommending impeachment. He's not a member of Congress. He's employed by the Department of Justice. So his job was to recommend or not recommend criminal prosecution, and then Congress can do with that what they may in terms of
and his recommendation didn't he turn over his recommendation along with his findings to Barr rather than make the recommendation himself?
But Barr is his superior, so he would have been giving that to Barr no matter what.
I know, but
that's what he was required to do.
Okay, I know, but I'm saying that you originally were. I guess I misunderstood your position. I thought you originally were saying that like Mueller. Now you're saying that he didn't have enough power, that it was Barr's authority to do so. But previously, I thought you said that Mueller did not recommend obstruction charges.
No, Mueller could have recommended obstruction charges per his investigative mandate. He chose not to, and he left it to Barr to make the ultimate decision as to whether to take the facts and arguments that Mueller had marshaled and put them into criminal charges. So Mueller could have said, we recommend charges, right, on obstruction, and then Barr could have said, okay, we're going to go forward with those charges or not. But Mueller didn't even take that step. He said, we're not making a recommendation one way or another on obstruction. Okay, and that was within his prescribed duties. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I misunderstood something there, because I assumed that it was I assumed that he had punted the outcome was going to be determined by Barr, and that's what Mueller was doing.
But it was within his capacities to make a recommendation as to obstruction if he saw fit to do that.
Anyway, okay.
Anyway, so we're getting into technical stuff now.
Okay. Fuck, what was I going to talk about? There was another thing that I wanted to talk about.
The Sri Lanka thing?
What? Well, no, before that, in regards to Russia, in regards to like Russia and the way people dealt with it. Okay, so I have some things that I wanted to say. So first and foremost,
sure.
So Sam and Glenn had a conversation, and I guess you can talk to Glenn about this as well, but my understanding is that do you disagree? Do you disagree that I don't know if you've listened to Sam and Glenn's conversation about this, but
yeah, I did.
Okay, so do you disagree that that Sam Seder need not apologize for having Marcy Wheeler on the Majority Report, or?
I 100% disagree with that. Not for having her on. Okay. Not for having her on. And this is the point that I tried to make to Sam Seder, but he was interrupting me every 5 seconds and basically having a hissy fit. And I tried to explicate my position on that as best I could, but it's a little difficult when your volume is turned down and you have a guy screaming at you and calling you a coward, right? So it was not that he had her on, because Aaron Monte had Marcy Wheeler on The Real News many times, but Aaron Monte actually pressed her on her positions and was doing an adversarial engagement with her. Sam Seder just let her rant on her conspiratorial, a take on everything that ended up being totally disproven by Mueller. Everything Marcy Wheeler claimed was going to come to fruition did not. And here's what Marcy Wheeler did. Empty wheel on Twitter for people who don't know. She claimed in July of 2018 that she possessed explosive evidence on collusion that she personally possessed. Marcy, possessed this, and then she proactively went to the FBI and said, here, let me meet with you willingly and voluntarily as a journalist of sorts, and let me burn a source in the process, which is the most mortal sin any journalist can ever commit, handing over your source to the cops. I mean, that truly would get you censured in most normal, circumstances. And Marcy then claimed that there was, so she did that, and she barely even gave any explanation for it. She still hasn't. Marcy said that she was under threat by Trump Russia hit squads who were going to kill her. I'm not kidding. Go look it up.
Okay, I don't know the extent of the as far as like what Marcy Wheeler
And,
had said.
Glenn,
We're talking
Glenn,
specifically. We're talking specifically
Glenn,
about having Marcy Wheeler, a person at the
well,
time that was knowledgeable and like a respected investigative journalist that Glenn Greenwald himself admitted that wanted to hire for the Intercept. Was talking.
Look at Glenn's piece. Go look at Glenn's piece from last week. He denounces stridently Marcy Wheeler.
Okay, my point is at the time, without people knowing the full details, of course, if like a respected investigative reporter is saying that they have this information, like I don't think having someone like that on your show is you know, the worst thing, especially if you're not covering, if you're not providing round the clock coverage to like Russiagate and like putting these pieces together, and it's just like something that every now and then you, with additional developing news, you every now and then cover the ongoing investigation.
It wasn't strictly a matter of having her on. I agree with having her on.
Oh, okay. That's all I wanted to clarify.
You can't just let her rant on her deluded conspiratorial kind of digressions for an hour and not challenge any of her claims, which were proven false.
Okay.
And that's what Sam Cedar did.
So this actually brings us into an interesting part of the conversation that I wanted to personally ask you. So if the things that this person has done in regards to that grand narrative, like Marcy Wheeler, means that you need to take an adversarial tone when you're engaging with them, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on your appearances on the Tucker Carlson show? Because and it's not even a gotcha. Like I genuinely want to know.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to discuss it. I'm a guest on the Tucker Carlson show, so I'm not hosting anybody for an interview where it would be within my abilities to challenge them in an adversarial way, right? So when you're on a TV show, you generally have like 2 to 4 minutes to talk about a specific topic. I've criticized elements of Tucker Carlson's public persona, his positions going back years and even into the present day. But if he wants me to come on and talk about the harms inflicted by Trump Russia, I feel like, and I know Glenn agrees with this as well, and he's done it even. I think it's wholly justified to go and discuss that from a non-Trump partisan perspective on a national news program. I have many vehement criticisms of Rachel Maddow, and I think she's done a lot of damage to the body politic. But if she invited me to come on her show and talk about, say, Trump vetoing the Yemen resolution last week, and I agree with her that that was a bad thing, I'm not going to launch into some tirade against Rachel Maddow in 4 minutes and derail the conversation. I don't think that's reasonable.
You really wouldn't actually bring up like any of the things that Rachel Maddow has done that you rightfully want to criticize her for when given the opportunity to be platformed by Rachel Maddow?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the context. I mean, I've got during my appearances on Tucker, there have been times where I've criticized Fox News, and I've criticized Trump. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of dependent on the conditions of the interview and like what the cadence of it and what the flow of it is. But I wouldn't just if Rachel asked me, for example, what do you think about the Trump veto and the Yemen resolution? I wouldn't just ignore that question and launch into a rant about her Russia cover. Maybe if there were some opportunity to raise it, I would, just as I raised the Fox News and Trump criticisms with Tucker.
Okay. Are you familiar with how Rutger Bregman conducted himself in an interview with Tucker Carlson that never actually aired? When he was brought on to do a similar thing, Rutger Bregman is a historian, and he's a leftist historian, and he made the news for having a brilliant analysis of how billionaires were hypocritical for riding private jets to Davos, and Tucker Carlson thought that this would be a good opportunity for Rutger to come on and dunk on said billionaires and play his populist message. But he did that. He played his part and talked about the billionaires and their hypocrisy and closing tax loopholes, and then tied it very skillfully back to how Fox News and Tucker Carlson engage in that same kind of damaging narrative every single day and do things that are far worse. So if Russiagate hysteria has been damaging to American political discourse, don't you think that Fox News, as a propaganda outlet for the Republican Party, has been tangibly far worse for American politics than this hyper focus on Russiagate for the past 3 years?
Well, I mean, MSNBC is a propaganda organ for the Democratic Party and for the CIA. So, I mean, yeah, if there was an opening where I could criticize MSNBC in the context of a 3-minute interview with Rachel Maddow, I would probably take it, just as I took it with Tucker in regards to Fox News. So,
Well,
I mean,
maybe
I don't
not the
really see a
Democratic Party.
distinction
I'd
there.
say, but like specific party interests, sure. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that it's for the Democratic Party, especially because they were talking about very deliberately talking about sliding to the right before.
Do you think it's morally condemnable for Greenwald when he's on Tucker, which is like every week or so, to not just blatantly ignore the questions asked to him and launch into a rant about how horrible Fox News is?
No, I think there is a very reasonable analysis that you can woe into your statement about how Russia has been this like Russia conversation has been really damaging for Democrats, and then turn around and talk about how Fox News engages in the same kind of propagandizing, and they've been doing it and very successfully, mind you, doing it for a very long time. And I think that yes, that should be done.
Okay,
I mean, look, I'm not
third-
opposed to talking to Republicans. I'm not one of those like liberals who gets like fucking, who starts screaming when Bernie Sanders went on a fucking town hall on Fox News. I think he did a great job with that. I've debated Ann Coulter on Fox, so I think there's a yeah. So obviously I have no problem with that. I have no problem with talking to fascists even, but when you are in the midst of one, when you're having a conversation on one show, especially only a week after some recently unearthed tapes about how a person who was very much in support of the false narrative, the WMD false narrative, and the Iraq war that was damaging to millions, as I'm sure you'll agree, was calling Iraqis primitive monkeys. I would probably bring that up as far as like as far as like media criticisms and the damaging narratives that they continue to fucking back. Because you've said in the past that the Russiagate hysteria might have even had some xenophobic elements to it, and that Russian people were being vilified inappropriately.
Not might. It does.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay. So, but don't you think
Papadopoulos
that's exactly what
asked by the
Fox
FBI
News
if he ever
does?
encountered. Papadopoulos was asked by the FBI explicitly if he ever encountered anyone with a quote Russian accent. So I mean, there's no question as to whether there was a xenophobic component
I mean, hey,
here.
if you think that I'm going to disagree with you on whether the intelligence community in the United States, I mean, every institutional power in the United States is backed up by white supremacy and xenophobia, I'm not going to disagree with you there. But my perspective again is that if we're going to be truly fair in our media analysis, I think we also have to admit that Fox News is way more damaging to the political discourse than the past 3 years of Rachel Maddow fucking screaming about how everything bad in American politics is somehow related back to Russia. I think that would be a pretty reasonable analysis, no? Or maybe you have a different perspective.
Well, I mean, I think given how dominant and central Trump Russia has been, I mean, if you grant that Trump Russia has been the dominant political 3 years, then if MSNBC has been a primary engine of that, and on behalf of the CIA and like retrograde elements of the Democratic Party, I mean, I don't know that it's that necessarily straightforward as to which one inflicted greater harms. I agree that Fox propagandizes and inflicts harms and is, kind of sinisterly close to Trump in a lot of ways. I mean, it's almost embarrassing when he's talking to Sean Hannity every night before bed. I mean, it's creepy. But I mean, the point is, all these corporate media entities have their own harms, and you have to navigate within them if you're given a platform in a way that doesn't just blow up your entire spot, so you're just thrown off. And I'm not saying that I'm not transparent and forthright when I'm on Tucker. I told you you go look at my March 22nd appearance on Tucker when I was brought on to talk about the Mueller report being submitted, but before we had actually seen it, and I brought up Fox's complicity in the WMD fiasco and rehabilitating people who were associated with the fiasco by putting them on air, and also Trump's failure to hold true to his campaign promises, which was to say that the Iraq War was a disaster, by bringing in people to the administration like John Bolton, who still doesn't admit that the Iraq War was a huge failure. So I mean,
Yeah.
so there
So
are.
so you agree that, like, I guess, especially given the fact that the Republicans maintain systemic power beyond like Fox News's propagandizing of certain perspectives, that it probably is a little bit more damaging in the long run and has long-lasting, tangible consequences in comparison to an exaggeration or hyperbole on an ongoing Russian investigation, albeit that might be backed somehow by like, I guess, elements within the CIA, as you're saying. I don't know about that. I guess I'm not as familiar.
Don't take my word for it. Go look at John. I mean, look at John Brennan. John Brennan was the head of the CIA under Obama, and he was central into putting forth this narrative in 2016. And then he was hired by NBC as a paid contributor to MSNBC to put forth the most hyperbolic spin night after night on this subject. So there's no question at all that the CIA was central to all this. It just came out a couple days ago. Bob Woodward says that the CIA was, quote, pushing the Steele dossier and incorporating it into its intelligence briefings in 2016. So there's no question as to the CIA's centrality in all this. And you can say that Fox has and the Republicans have systemic power. True, they have systemic power in some ways, but power in the United States is multifaceted, right? So there are different nodes of power. Fox and
or in
Trump
some
and
ways,
Republicans have some
they're
power,
two different, or in some ways they're two separate heads of the same
power.
machine. Or in some ways, they're.
But the Democrats and the liberals have some systemic power as well. Whether you're talking about the Democratic Party, who now control the House of Representatives, whether you're talking about Democratic governors and even elements of the business community that are aligned with Democrats, such as Silicon Valley. So I mean, there are competing nodes of power here, and I don't think you can just straightforwardly and simplistically say that it's only Fox and the Republicans who command all the power.
But what I'm simply stating is that I think for the past, I guess, 3 decades now, since Fox has been around, they have very deliberately crafted a narrative that has completely taken over the Republican Party and the Republican base of voters. And my argument is that is ultimately much more damaging than the past 3 years of conspiracy theories that have exaggerated an actual credible investigation that was ongoing at the time, a credible investigation that turned out different results than what people expected, and we should learn from that. But to say that the Republican Party and Fox News is not infinitely worse in how successful they've been in regards to how they've been able to change the minds of voters for the past 3 decades is I don't know. I mean, I think it's silly.
I'm not making a conclusive judgment as to whether it's as infinitely worse. I'll even grant you that, let's say it is worse. Okay, so how does that bear on me going on a national TV show that's watched by a lot of regular people across the country, including Democrats and liberals who watch? I mean, I just don't see how that bears on my.
Well, I mean, you pride yourself on moral consistency.
I mean,
so that's why I was asking. What's your
justification for going on Fox? I mean, you said you were on, right?
Yeah, I went on Fox to shit on Ann Coulter. That's my point. I went on Fox to have a conversation with Ann Coulter, which I successfully used to shit on her because she is, I guess, a firebrand, or to say the least, definitely a fascist propagandist.
Couldn't you argue that you were just like her foil or her useful idiot? I mean, I'm not saying that you're a useful
idiot. It depends on how you conduct yourself, but I think ultimately I still very successfully was able to dismantle some of the damaging narratives that she was trying to put out there. And that's exactly what I'm saying. And at the very least I tried, but beyond that I think I was successful. But that's my point. Is that going on? I mean, if I were to go on Tucker Carlson, or just like I would expect you to go on Rachel Maddow and definitely bring up the fact that and I think that you would as well, definitely bring up the fact that you would talk about all of the things that she said in the past about Russia and the damaging aspects of that. I would expect you, someone who is morally consistent, to at least hold Tucker's feet to the fire a little bit in regards to some of the statements he's made or some of the statements that he continues to make. Like right after you get off that show, he's still going to talk about fucking birth rates. You know what I mean? Like it's not any different. Like for that segment alone, he might use you or Glenn Greenwald's credibility to attack the left, as you guys are technically center left or leftist journalists. But that's all he's doing is showing how diverse his show is by having someone he agrees with on one individual subject and trying to shoehorn you into that. And don't you think that you become, to use your own words, the useful idiot in that respect?
Well, I just don't understand. Here's one thing I don't understand. Bernie Sanders collaborated. So Bernie Sanders' relationship with Fox News is far more tangible than anything I've ever done. Bernie Sanders collaborated with Fox News to do a very, relatively friendly town hall, more friendly than his CNN town halls, to advance his political interests. And I didn't see a whole lot of people. There were a couple raising objections, but I didn't see a whole lot of people saying that he's somehow abetting white nationalism and like giving credibility to the
because he didn't agree with them. He
pushed
Medicare for all and his opinions.
But he's still making use of
but he's still making use of this incredibly.
But he's still making use of this incredibly damaging propaganda organ to advance his political interest, right?
Yeah, because his political interest didn't happen to align with the Fox News political interest. My point is, I don't have an issue with going on. My point is, I don't have an issue with going on Fox News, Michael. My point isn't going on Fox News. I told you I've gone on Fox News. I'm saying, and I don't mind you going on Fox News either. Plus, in the end of the day, who gives a fuck what I think, right? I'm some dipshit with a Twitch account.
I care.
But my point is, going on Fox News is one thing, especially if you're going to utilize the platform that they're giving you to spread your message. But going on Fox News and only agreeing with them and never actually in the same conversation, you could literally redirect the blame back to Fox News. Never actually doing that makes you seem like it gives them exactly what they wanted.
Number one,
if Bernie Sanders went on Fox News on the town hall and talked about how, you know what, you're right, immigrants are causing problems, and if that was his perspective, if that was like a policy perspective that he had, and then he only pushed that and never talked about Medicare for all or never talked about fucking corporations, never talked about raising the taxes on the wealthy, then 1,000% I would agree with you. I'd be like, what the fuck are you doing, Bernie Sanders? Why are you essentially agreeing with these people? Because
number one, I just told you that I just cited to you an instance in which I did go on Fox and challenge them for rehabilitating Iraq, challenge Trump directly by name. So I have done
we're
that.
talking about media analysis and how damaging it was, because that was the overarching. That's like the overwhelming narrative.
No, but you're saying I only go on to agree in which I actually challenge them.
No.
So,
I'm saying when you're talking about damaging media analysis that has impacted political discourse in a negative way, which is what the main like argument that you are having on Fox News, right, with Tucker Carlson, or like agreeing with Tucker Carlson on that. If that's the conversation, then don't you think that it's reasonable to at least bring up what Fox News has been doing for the past 30 years, like at least once?
But the thing is, I just told you that I brought up the fact that they have rehabilitated Iraq war criminals. So I mean, that's a pretty important criticism, I would think. The other thing is, I'm not going on to agree with them just because I'm saying, oh my God, I got booked on Fox News, therefore it's my job to agree with them. It's because I have a position that I would have expressed on any venue, including on your show or including on left-wing podcasts that I've done. Any venue, I would have said essentially the same thing. So if they want to have me say that in the context of a 4-minute segment on Tucker's show, then yeah, I'm going to do it. And I think, it kind of comes down to, and I think Glenn would agree with this most likely, our identities, so to say, are a little more journalistically oriented than maybe you. And there's nothing wrong with divergent identities in that way. It's just that I'm not looking at it primarily through the frame of, oh my, I'm an activist of side of
you don't have to be, not at all. I'm just talking about, like, what did you criticize Rachel Maddow on when you went on Fox News? Those same criticisms could absolutely be launched against Tucker Carlson and Fox News. And it would be very reasonable. This is what I'm saying. I don't have a problem. Again, I don't have a problem with you going on Fox News. I think it's great. I mean,
so you think every single time you go on Fox News in a 3-minute segment, it's your moral obligation to always challenge the structural impact of Fox News every time?
Especially if it pertains to the conversation at hand in regards to
well, I mean,
damaging media narratives. Sure, yeah.
In the one time that I keep citing to you where it did pertain, I did so.
I know, but the same could be said about MSNBC, also, rehabilitating Iraq war criminals. So that's a little different than, again, directly criticizing Fox News for stoking racial animosity.
But here's another point
for decades.
Here's another point that I have to just I can't stand this logic. I have to just flatly reject it. This idea that is popular on the internet, on Twitter in particular, that by appearing on a show, you are somehow either overtly or tacitly endorsing everything the host has ever said in his entire career. I know you didn't say that, but a lot of people do say that.
At least fuck those people. I go on. I talk to Nazis, Michael.
Guilt by association game that's played. That I think.
But I talk to Nazis, Michael. Obviously, no one is. People say that about me all the fucking time too.
I don't talk to Nazis. So that's
I'm saying, yeah. I mean, there's a way in which I conduct myself when I'm talking to Nazis. But again, given what we know about Tucker Carlson and all the things that he said, if I were to go on Tucker Carlson's show, or if I were to go on a Nazi show, or someone who's more of an overt white nationalist than one who like hides dog whistles and very deliberately so in his rhetoric, I would most likely bring that up, which it is the elephant in that room. Do you not agree? Do you not think that it's the elephant in that room when you go on Tucker Carlson's show that every single thing that you're criticizing Rachel Maddow for, Tucker Carlson has done throughout his entire career in much worse and much more damaging ways? I mean, you have the 2012 tweet where you admitted to that, and I just want to know if your perspective has changed at all, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of really clever trolls went and found some old tweets where I criticized Tucker
by the way, I
Carlson
agree with your perspective. That's why I'm asking.
As if that somehow means that I'm a hypocrite for appearing on his show.
I don't think you're a hypocrite for appearing on a show, Michael. I would
appear on Rachel Maddow's show, so it's the same logic.
I don't think you're a hypocrite for appearing on Tucker Carlson's show. I said this multiple times. I don't think you're a hypocrite for appearing on Tucker Carlson's show.
So what's the ultimate point?
But I do think that you were used, and so was Glenn Greenwald, very successfully so, for going on Tucker Carlson's show and never opposing Tucker Carlson in a similar fashion to how you opposed Rachel Maddow and the Democratic Party as it pertained to Russiagate. Because what's the worst part? What's the worst part about Russiagate? Is the fact that we kind of strayed away from actual political discourse and things that could be important to the American public. Well, Tucker Carlson and Fox News does that every night with the racial animosity that they create, with white nativist immigration policies that they not only craft but literally push Trump to follow through on. That's what I'm saying. Like, it's just,
If I'm asked to appear on Fox to talk about Trump Russia, then if in the context of a conversation about Trump Russia, I can incorporate criticisms of Fox that derive from the structural long-standing harms that they've inflicted on the populace, I will do so and have done so. But I'm not going to just completely derail a conversation and go in the context of a very tight 4-minute segment and rant against some unrelated issue that I agree is harmful, but it's just not pertinent. And I would do the same on Rachel or CNN, which I also have criticisms of, or virtually any venue. So that's my basic
by the
response.
way, you don't have to change the subject again, like when you're having that conversation in regards to Russiagate, because the same, like I said, the same criticisms could absolutely be launched against Fox News as well, as far as the damaging consequences of Russiagate. But anyway, it's fine. We don't have to talk about that any further. But like, just know that I don't think you're a hypocrite for going on Fox News. I just think it's bad to go on Fox News and not address the same kind of problems that Fox News engages in while only attacking the left or only attacking Rachel Maddow.
But the implication from these trolls who surfaced an old tweet of mine, oh my, criticized Tucker, was that I was somehow hypocritical for appearing on a show, as if my appearing on a show was a endorsement of everything he's done over the course of his entire career, which I just think is the stupidest possible logic.
I don't think anyone here. I don't think that. I don't think you're.
I know you don't. I'm glad you don't think it, but people on Twitter.
I don't think other
do.
people. I mean, look, people think dumb shit. People thought that Trump was fucking Putin's crony. Okay, so we already know that people think dumb shit. So that's not going to change. Like that's not. Unfortunately, that's never going to change. But my point is, both Rachel Maddow and to a much greater extent Tucker Carlson are responsible for misinformation and causing people to be hysterical. And I would just think about that next time I'm on the Tucker Carlson show. And you don't have to if you don't want to. I mean, it's just, that's my perspective. That's probably why they don't fucking ask me to be back on Fox any time soon. And that's probably why they won't ask me to be on fucking any of these other mainstream shows. Because just like if I were to go on MSNBC, I would probably talk about the same exact criticisms against MSNBC, and I would do the same for Fox News. Anyway, but that's just me. It might be a little different. So, okay, so we talked about that. What else was I going to? Oh, last thing. So you're before you go, the reason why we had this conversation to begin with was because we were talking about Sri Lanka, or you were talking about Sri Lanka, and you said. Let me just find that tweet really quickly, or you can say it again if you want to.
Yeah, I'll just relay it. I mean, the basic point.
I'm gonna grab water real quick while you do that because I'm thirsty.
Okay, so basically what I said was something to the effect of, there was this really shocking series of attacks in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday that targeted minority Christians and some Western tourists as well, apparently, but seemingly focused on Christians, bombing of churches, and the attacks, as far as we know, were carried out by Islamists. So I just thought it seemed notable to me that, American left liberals, relatively speaking, don't assign that much significance to a very craven and extreme attack like that. But when there's any instance of white nationalist, quote unquote, terror or violence abroad, it automatically gets transmuted into this very overwhelming and dominant media narrative on the part of left liberals in particular. And I have reservations about that from the standpoint of I have been a strident critic of the tendency on the right to inflate the threat of Islamist or jihadist or whatever term you want to use, at least as it relates to the U.S., because although there are occasionally attacks carried out in the U.S. by people who proclaim allegiance to ISIS, or whatever, like the Orlando club shooting or the truck attack or van attack in New York City in 2017, it doesn't rise to the level of a threat where everybody should be losing their minds over it and curtailing civil liberties as a result of it. And I see a lot of those tendencies that are associated with the right in terms of inflating the threat of radical Islam exhibited to some degree on the left, or in terms of inflating the threat of white nationalist terrorists. Not to say that I think that there's no threat associated with people who are genuine white supremacists. I just think that there's an ideological motivation for these people to elevate those sorts as some kind of political enemy. And if they're your enemy, fine, that's totally justified. But you shouldn't overstate or exaggerate or inflate the extent to which they're a living threat. When if they commit violent acts, they're isolated and maybe arguably even more isolated than these Islamic attacks. So that's basically my general point of view.
Okay, and the question I asked you was, don't you think that like white nationalist or white supremacist, or at least at the very least like far right anti-government extremist terror is far more significant as a national security threat in the United States than at the moment than Islamist terror, I guess. Don't you think that that's part of the reason why people most likely talk about this, especially when the attackers themselves, the Christchurch shooter, for example, actually reference U.S. politics heavily, and one could make the argument that like they push forward this white nationalist rhetoric that is largely coming from like North American white nationalist political actors and pundits, whether it be the Great Replacement or birth rates and things of that nature, and that this would be a different form of terror, like stochastic terror, which is getting a lot of lone wolves to kind of act on behalf of the same kind of the same message that's being put out there that impacts American national security in a more devastating fashion.
Well, in terms of which is a greater threat domestically, I actually think it's somewhat arguable. I'm not even that interested in rendering a judgment one way or another. Either threat should be irrationally inflated. But in terms of recent history, I mean, I can name you a couple attacks that were pretty significant in the past, I don't know, 5 years that were launched by people who were, proclaimed to be radical Muslims or Islamists.
Where though? Are we talking about Europe and America or in the U.S.? Okay,
in the U.S. San Bernardino shooting in 2015.
Perfect, but statistics still bear out. I mean, statistics still show that it's overwhelmingly white nationalist terror is overwhelmingly more significant as a national security threat. Something that the Department of Justice themselves admitted only recently, and something that they haven't dealt with for a very long time, despite the fact that many consultants internally had said that you should probably deal with this, and this is becoming an ongoing problem. Again, it probably.
I actually think it's arguable. Let's even grant that it is it's like 20% more dangerous, 50% more dangerous than Islamists.
Well, 75% to 25 is pretty significant, I think, and that's.
Well, the point is, it's still a relatively minor threat overall, right? So you ought not to inflate that threat, whether it's coming from Islamists or white nationalists, because that engenders all kinds of irrational emotional reactions, such as curtailing civil liberties or taking steps that restrict speech or censoring the internet, that kind of thing.
Wait, when's the last time we curtailed liberties for in an effort to combat against white nationalist domestic terror?
Well, I mean, after the Oklahoma City bombing, the Clinton administration, and I know that's a little while ago now.
It was a very long time ago, man.
But it's actually a relevant precedent, just as 9/11 would be a relevant precedent.
I wasn't even referencing 9/11, but go on. I wasn't going.
I mean, they're both terroristic incidents, right?
Okay, go on. What happened after Oklahoma City bombing?
After 9/11, you can go. I mean, after the Oklahoma City bombing, go and look. There were a lot of counter-terror measures that the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton himself, advocated that were later folded into the Patriot Act in some ways. Mm-hmm. So the specter of terrorism, whether it's emanating from a jihadist or anti-government right-wing people, can always be used to justify measures that curtail speech or civil liberties.
So wait, why do you think that we haven't reshifted our focus over to white nationalist or, again, far right terror in the United States if it's so prevalent? When we consider, at the very least, the sheer amount of far right terror versus, in your words, Islamist terror in the United States.
When you say the sheer amount of far right terror, I mean, let's name some recent incidents that could be attributed to far right terror. So you have the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh last fall, which definitely was an instance of far right terror, no doubt about it. You can name a couple, I guess. I mean, the Christchurch thing was in New Zealand. Yeah, he did.
In 2018, according to the ADL, it was all of them, just for the record.
Okay,
all deaths in an extremist incident were.
I mean, the ADL has a lot of. The ADL has
sure,
a lot of
I agree.
Issues.
They're not very favorable of people that push anything remotely pro-Palestine.
Exactly. So I don't really view them as a credible source, frankly. And I think there are issues in terms of reporting methods. I mean, if you actually look at the ADL study that was put out in
But
it
if they're
was
anti-Palestine, don't you
2018.
think that it would probably play into their narrative that like Islamic terror is a problem? Uh, what I
Sure,
mean?
I would be skeptical of their claims about Islamic terror or
No,
white
but given the
nationalism. I just
fact
don't
that
think
they
they're
haven't
credible.
mentioned it and are exclusively focusing on white nationalist terror, don't you think that there's like a little bit more credibility there because of that? Or at least that's the way
I
I
don't know.
look
I don't
at
know.
it.
I don't know. I don't think it's I don't know that that's empirically grounded necessarily. I mean, I think the study that was touted in the media that was ADL derived, and I have to go in like 2 minutes. Sorry, let me just hold on. Let me just 1 second. Sorry. Should I whistle while we wait?
No, it's all good. Um, do your thing.
But
Well,
if you
yeah.
look at the methodology of that ADL study, which was bandied around in the media as evidence that there was this great surge of white nationalists or Nazi terror in the United States, a lot of it derived from just an increase in overall reporting from various places in the U.S. rather than an aggregate increase from year to year. It was just that there was overall more people reporting various things. I mean, go look at actually. There are some articles that I could reference that are from
Yeah,
legitimate
hate
sources.
crimes are on the increase because precincts are starting to actually report it, where there are still thousands of precincts all around the nation that aren't reporting it. That's not what I'm talking about, though. What I'm talking about specifically is far right, like aside from the ADL report.
But the whole but let me just make a point here because my tweet was in reference to stuff that was going on abroad, right? So we could talk about the U.S. It's sort of a separate discussion.
No, but it was. I know, but the reason why you brought it up was because people aren't talking about this as passionately as they talk about white supremacist terror. And I'm simply stating that maybe the reason why they talk more frequently about white nationalist terror whenever something happens worldwide is twofold. One, because oftentimes that white nationalist terror is either nearly identical or directly motivated by the same kind of mentality that motivates white nationalist terror here. And two, white nationalist terror here is far more significant and more prevalent than Islamist terror. And that's precisely why people are talking about it, especially because the Department of Defense has openly admitted that they have fucked up, whether it be having white nationalists in their ranks in the police force, white nationalists and far right extremists within the military, and also just far like the hubs that have been created for far right terror all around the country that haven't been dealt with, that haven't been dealt with thus far. And that's probably why people are ringing the alarm bells. And beyond that, the real reason why not enough people are talking about Sri Lanka is not because it's Muslims killing Christians or whatever. The real reason why no one's talking about it is because it's fucking brown people. It's brown on brown violence. Just like whenever Al Qaeda or any other fucking now completely fucking dead terror cell on its last limb will go and blow up a marketplace in Afghanistan, and we never even fucking talk about it here, is the same reason why we don't talk about Sri Lanka in that respect, and the same reason why the only fucking news articles that you hear in regards to Sri Lanka right now are the billionaire ASOS CEO's 3 children that were killed, and like who the American casualties are. That's why. It's because people don't regard brown lives as lives.
I think the U.S., in terms of its domestic political situation, does have a lot of culpability in Islamist terror abroad, both because of its foreign policy decisions and because of its, support for Saudi Arabia, which exports extreme Wahhabi Islam, which is then embraced by, jihadist groups around the world, and ISIS would be a perfect example of that in terms of the U.S. having direct complicity in them gaining the momentum that they did. And you had ISIS subjugating and murdering minority Christians in the Middle East. There wasn't. I just think it's notable that there wasn't a whole lot of left liberal discussion in terms of the repression that those people were inflicted with. And I actually have met some of them personally, and their stories are just horrible. It's like beyond belief. I mean, some of their like ancient, homelands were just obliterated by ISIS, and it's disgusting. And I just think that there's something out of whack proportionally there. Not to say that you can't focus on the harms of white nationalist terror, right? Of course you can. And the New Zealand shooting was sort of unique in that, yeah, he did definitely tailor it to an American audience, and he explicitly stated that that was his intention.
Yeah.
So yeah, I acknowledge that, and he like made it maximum for maximum like social media shareability in a really depraved way. And he actually did self-identify as a fascist. So yeah, of course, that was something legitimate to focus on. But I just think, in terms of proportionality, I find a weird discrepancy there that I don't think is justifiable empirically or even logically.
I'm just saying that. Okay, well, my point simply was that you asked the question, right? I think in your tweet, if I'm not mistaken, or you implied that there was a question, and the answer to that question is yes, because white nationalist terror or far right terror is way more significant in the United States than Islamic terror at this point, and that's precisely why people and also not dealt with appropriately.
But you keep making that assertion. I mean, can you name what are some in the past 5 years or so? What are some major incidents of like extreme white nationalistic terror attacks that, like, say, had 5 or more casualties?
I mean, you
We named
mentioned some of them already, like the ones that
Pittsburgh is one.
Yeah,
Pittsburgh synagogue.
Dylan Roof. I mean, these are all.
That's another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just named you like 4 or 5 big ones that were, Islamist, including
I know, but it
what
wasn't
at the time was the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history in Orlando. So I mean, I just think it's like arguable, and I'm saying don't inflate the threat either way.
It's not an
if white
inflation. I'm
nationalism
talking
is
about
worse or
simple
Islamism is worse,
statistics, though.
regardless, don't inflate the threat.
Okay, it's not an inflation of the threat if one is being dealt with by even fucking curtailing or complete wholesale like targeting Muslims that are like targeting like intellectually disabled Muslims on behalf of the FBI to like get them to fucking get them to like engage in terroristic activities so they can fucking pat themselves in the back. Going as far as to do that on the one hand, and never really focusing on the terror threat that white nationalism presents is the reason why probably a lot of people are ringing the alarm bells. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I just think there has been a big focus on the white nationalist threat, at least recently, to the point where it reminds me, or it's reminiscent of, it seems, the undue focus that was placed on these so-called Islamic threat.
Well, because
for
the
a
difference
long time
is
in the Bush years.
I know, but the difference is being Muslim is not a bad thing. Being a white nationalist is a bad thing, unless you don't have an issue with that.
Being a radical jihadist is kind of a bad thing, right?
Yeah, of course, but being a Muslim is not being a radical jihadist. There's a billion Muslims on this planet. Like, what percentage of them are radical jihadists?
A small percent, of course. I'm not saying, but it's a bad thing to be a radical. It's a bad thing to be a radical, violent white nationalist.
I know, but
I'm not sure what the
white
point is
nationalism, there. At the heart of white nationalism, you have exclusion and you have inflicting damage on anyone who is not white. At the heart of being Muslim is not like jihad and fucking killing a bunch of people. It's just you're just a Muslim. Sure. So that's the point. So the government taking steps, the government taking additional steps to fucking literally curtail civil liberties and like take them away from all Muslims is an overreaction. Whereas the government not doing anything to prevent white nationalist terror, possibly because white nationalism or white supremacy does not impose any sort of structural threat to American hegemony.
Taking away the civil liberties of even the most objectionable people. So like, violent white supremacists or violent.
I'm not even saying that we should take their civil liberties away. I'm just saying we should maybe focus on it a little bit more and not take away spending from. Maybe at least like set up an investigative unit that instead of focusing on black identity extremism at the behest of like Alex Jones conspiracy videos, maybe they could focus on white identity extremism, which has been proven to be a threat in this country.
Well, I mean, I don't put a lot of faith in the investigative law enforcement agencies to come up with solutions to social problems. So that's not really what I normally recommend.
I mean, I don't think that they're going to be able to do a better job, but maybe they could stop a few. Who knows?
Yeah. All right. Well, I got to go.
Okay. All right.
But
Well,
this
thank
was
you for
but
coming
this was
on.
this was good. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, thank you for the enlightening conversation, Michael Tracey. Do you
Yeah,
want to plug
likewise.
your Twitter?
Yeah, it's M Tracey, MTRACEY. I also have a Patreon and a YouTube and everything else. So gonna have a couple interesting interviews this coming week. So be on the lookout for that.
Okay. All right. Peace, dude.
All right. Thanks, Hassan.